In the summer of 1846, a sealed ledger was placed in the Adams County Courthouse basement in Natchez, Mississippi. The ledger remained there untouched for 112 years. When county workers finally opened it during a renovation project in 1958, they found 73 pages of daily records documenting what happened to Margaret Halloway between June 14th and November 9th of 1846. Each entry was written in the same meticulous handwriting recording weights, behaviors, punishments, and observations. The final entry, dated November 9th, consisted of only 4 words. The treatment is concluded. Margaret Halloway was the 23-year-old daughter of Edmund Halloway, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Adams County. On June 13, 1846, Edmund announced to his household staff and several enslaved workers that Margaret required specialized treatment for her condition. He had constructed a treatment facility in the large barn behind the main house. 3 enslaved men would be placed in charge of Margaret's daily regimen under Edmund's direct supervision. The treatment would continue until Margaret showed sufficient improvement. Margaret entered that barn weighing 247 pounds. According to the ledger, she was described as disobedient, gluttonous, and morally compromised. She had refused 4 marriage proposals, spoken disrespectfully to her father on multiple occasions, and was rumored to have romantic feelings for an inappropriate man. Edmund told his neighbors that he had consulted with physicians in New Orleans, who recommended rigorous labor therapy as a cure for female hysteria and moral weakness. What actually happened in that barn over the next 5 months was far worse than labor therapy. It was systematic psychological destruction designed to break Margaret's will completely, and the 3 men Edmund placed in charge of his daughter were caught in an impossible situation. They were ordered to treat the plantation owner's daughter like field workers, to push her beyond exhaustion, to show no mercy or kindness, but they were also human beings, watching a woman being destroyed day by day, and eventually they had to make a choice. The story would have remained buried in that courthouse basement except for 3 things. First, the ledger contained details that contradicted the official story Edmund told his neighbors. Second, archaeologists discovered the barn's foundation in 2003 during a historical survey, and what they found in the burned remains raised disturbing questions. And third, descendants of one of the 3 enslaved men kept family records that included testimony about what really happened during those 5 months. Testimony that was finally made public in 2007. This is the story they tried to bury. This is what happened to Margaret Halloway in that barn, and this is why everyone who witnessed it either disappeared or took the secret to their graves. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, I need you to do something for me right now. If this story is already making your skin crawl, if you are the kind of person who wants to know the dark truths that history tried to hide, hit that subscribe button. This channel uncovers the stories they do not teach in schools, the secrets locked away in courthouse basement and forgotten archives. And I want to know where you are listening from. Drop a comment telling me your state or city. Are you from Mississippi? Does your family have connections to Adams County? Have you heard whispers about stories like this in your own community? Let me know. Now, let us go back to Riverbend Plantation in the spring of 1846 when Edmund Halloway was known as the most moral man in Adams County. Edmund Halloway was 51 years old. In 1846, he had inherited Riverbend Plantation from his father in 1823 when he was 28 years old. The plantation covered 2,000 acres of rich Mississippi soil along the Mississippi River about 12 miles north of Natchez. Edmund grew cotton primarily, but also maintained tobacco fields and extensive vegetable gardens. He owned 137 enslaved people, making him one of the larger slaveholders in the county, though not quite among the absolute elite who owned 300 or more. What distinguished Edmund was not the size of his holdings, but his reputation. He was known throughout Adams County as a model Christian gentleman. He attended First Presbyterian Church every Sunday without fail. He taught Bible study classes on Wednesday evenings. He donated generously to the church's missionary fund and to the local orphanage. He had sponsored the construction of a new school building in Natchez, paying for most of the costs himself. When neighbors faced financial difficulties, Edmund was often the one who extended loans on generous terms or helped arrange credit. Edmund had married Sarah Chandler in 1824. Sarah came from a prominent Charleston family and brought a substantial dowry. She was a quiet, religious woman who devoted herself to managing the household and raising their 2 children. Margaret was born in 1823, shortly before Edmund and Sarah married, though this timing was never discussed publicly. A son, Edmund Jr., was born in 1826 but died of fever before his 2nd birthday. Sarah never fully recovered from that loss. She became withdrawn, spending most of her time in her room reading scripture and writing letters to missionaries abroad. Sarah died in 1839 when Margaret was 16. The official cause was fever, but people whispered that Sarah had simply given up, that she had lost her will to live after her son's death and had gradually faded away. Edmund grieved publicly and appropriately. He wore black for a year. He commissioned a marble monument for Sarah's grave. He spoke movingly at her funeral about her devotion to God and family. No one questioned that Edmund had been a faithful, loving husband. After Sarah's death, Edmund focused his attention on Margaret. She was his only surviving child, his heir, and his greatest disappointment. Margaret had been a difficult child, according to Edmund. She asked too many questions. She read books that were not appropriate for young ladies. She expressed opinions when silence would have been more becoming. As she grew older, these tendencies worsened. By the time she was 20, Margaret was openly challenging Edmund's authority, questioning his decisions, and behaving in ways that scandalized polite society. The weight was part of the problem. Margaret had always been a large girl, but after her mother's death, she gained substantial weight. By 1845, she weighed well over 200 pounds, making her grotesque by the standards of the time. Edmund was horrified and ashamed. How could he find a suitable husband for a daughter who looked like that? What kind of man would accept such a wife? But the weight was not the real issue. The real issue was that Margaret had a mind of her own and refused to pretend otherwise. She had received an excellent education, better than most women of her era. Because Edmund had initially wanted her to be accomplished and refined, he had hired tutors in literature, history, French, and music. He had allowed her access to his extensive library. He had encouraged intellectual development because he assumed it wowould make Margaret a more interesting wife for whatever wealthy man eventually married her. Instead, education had made Margaret dangerous. She had read Mary Wollstonecraft and other writers who argued for women's rights and education. She had studied the abolitionist newspapers that somehow made their way to Mississippi despite being banned. She had formed her own opinions about slavery, about women's roles, about society's structure, and she was not good at hiding those opinions. The first serious incident occurred in 1843 when Margaret was 20. Edmund was hosting a dinner party for several prominent planters and their wives. The conversation turned to the question of slavery's expansion into new territories. One guest argued that slavery was a positive good, that enslaved people were better off than they would be in Africa, that the institution was sanctioned by scripture and natural law. Margaret, who had been expected to remain silent and decorative, spoke up. She said she found it difficult to believe that people torn from their families and forced to work without compensation were better off than free people in their homeland. She suggested that perhaps the real question was not whether slavery benefited enslaved people, but whether it corrupted the souls of those who practiced it. The silence that followed was absolute. No one contradicted Margaret directly. No one argued with her. They simply stared, shocked that a woman would express such views, especially in mixed company, especially in her father's house. Edmund ended the dinner party shortly after, making excuses about Margaret's health, suggesting she was overtired and not herself. After the guests left, Edmund took Margaret to his study and explained that she had embarrassed him, had potentially damaged his standing in the community, and would never speak about such topics again in his house. Margaret apologized, but Edmund knew it was not sincere. She was sorry she had caused a scene, but she was not sorry for her opinions. Over the following months, there were other incidents. Margaret was overheard asking enslaved house servants about their families, where they had come from, whether they had children who had been sold away. She was seen giving food to children in the quarters. She was caught teaching a young enslaved girl basic letters, a clear violation of Mississippi law. Edmund tried various approaches. He restricted Margaret's access to books, allowing her only approved religious texts. He forbade her from interacting with enslaved workers except to give direct orders. He arranged introduction to suitable men, hoping marriage would solve the problem by making Margaret someone else's responsibility. 4 men courted Margaret between 1843 and 1845. All 4 eventually proposed. Margaret refused every one of them. Her reasons varied. One man was boring, another was cruel to his servants, a third had terrible table manners. But the real reason Edmund suspected was that Margaret did not want to marry at all. She wanted independence, wanted control of her own life, wanted things that women simply could not have. Edmund tried explaining this to her. He told her that unmarried women had no place in society, that she would become an object of pity and mockery if she remained single, that she needed a husband to provide for her and give her life meaning and purpose. Margaret listened to these lectures with barely concealed contempt. She told Edmund that she would rather be an old maid than marry a man she did not love or respect. She said she was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs and did not need a husband to provide meaning to her existence. She suggested that perhaps if society's expectations were unreasonable, the problem was with society, not with her. By early 1846, Edmund was at his wits' end. Margaret was 23, unmarried, overweight, and increasingly defiant. She was becoming an embarrassment that threatened Edmund's reputation. People were starting to talk. They wondered why Edmund could not control his own daughter. They questioned his authority and judgment. Some suggested that perhaps Margaret's behavior reflected Edmund's own failings as a father and as a Christian. Edmund could not tolerate that. His reputation was everything. He had spent decades building an image of himself as a moral authority, a pillar of the community, a man whose household reflected godly order and proper hierarchy. Margaret was destroying that image. She had to be fixed. She had to be brought under control. She had to be made into the kind of woman who would reflect well on her father rather than embarrassing him. In May of 1846, Edmund traveled to New Orleans for 2 weeks. He told his household staff that he was conducting business, meeting with cotton factors and bankers. That was partially true. But Edmund also met with men who understood how to break difficult women, how to make them compliant, how to strip away willfulness and replace it with obedience. These were not physicians or psychiatrists. They were overseers and slave breakers, men who specialized in crushing the spirit of enslaved people who showed too much independence or resistance. Edmund explained his situation. He needed his daughter broken, without visible marks, without public scandal, without anything that would raise questions or draw attention. The treatment needed to appear legitimate, needed to be something he could describe to neighbors as medical therapy recommended by experts. He needed Margaret transformed into an obedient, marriageable woman who would accept whatever husband Edmund eventually found for her. The men Edmund consulted gave him detailed advice. Physical labor, they said, was effective for breaking both body and spirit. Exhaustion prevented clear thinking and resistance. Isolation cut people off from support and made them dependent on their captors. Unpredictable treatment, sometimes harsh and sometimes less so, kept people off balance and unable to develop effective coping strategies. Humiliation destroyed pride and sense of self, and most importantly, the breaking needed to be systematic, documented, and relentless. Every day had to chip away at the person's resistance until nothing remained but compliance. Edmund returned to Riverbend Plantation on May 26th with a plan. He spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He selected the large barn behind the main house, a structure used primarily for storing equipment and occasionally for processing crops. The barn was solid, 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with thick walls and a loft for hay storage. Edmund had enslaved workers clear out most of the equipment, leaving only what would be needed for Margaret's treatment. He installed heavy locks on all the doors. He had hooks embedded in the main support beams. He brought in a grain mill, the kind used to grind corn, requiring someone to push a heavy wooden arm in endless circles. He set up a sleeping area in one corner, nothing but a thin mattress on the floor. He brought in a desk and chair for himself, along with the leather-bound ledger where he would document everything. Edmund also selected the 3 enslaved men who would be responsible for implementing Margaret's daily routine. His choice of men was calculated carefully. He needed people who would follow orders without question, who would not show Margaret sympathy or kindness that might undermine the treatment, but who also would not harm her in ways that would create visible evidence of abuse. He chose Benjamin, aged 38, a field, and who had been on the plantation for 15 years. Benjamin was steady, reliable, and had never given the overseers any trouble. He had a wife named Ruth and 3 children. Edmund knew that Benjamin would do whatever was necessary to protect his family, which meant he would follow orders no matter how distasteful. He chose Samuel, aged 27, who worked primarily in the stables. Samuel had been born on Riverbend Plantation and had never known any other life. He was quiet, kept to himself, and did his work without complaint. Edmund had no reason to expect any resistance from Samuel, and he chose Daniel, aged 33, a skilled carpenter who handled repairs around the plantation. Daniel could read and write, having been taught by a previous owner before being sold to Edmund in 1838. Edmund knew that Daniel's literacy made him potentially dangerous, but it also made him useful. Daniel could help maintain the treatment records if needed. On June 13th, Edmund called the 3 men to his study. He explained what would happen starting the next day. His daughter required treatment for her condition, The treatment would involve rigorous physical labor and strict discipline. The three men would be responsible for supervising Margaret's daily routine. They would ensure she completed all assigned tasks. They would record her behavior, her weight, her compliance, or resistance. They would show her no special consideration due to her status as the master's daughter. In fact, they would treat her exactly as they would treat any new field worker, with the expectation of hard work and absolute obedience. Benjamin asked what would happen if they refused. Edmund's response was immediate and clear. Refusal would result in Benjamin's family being sold separately to different plantations in the Deep South. Ruth would go to one plantation, the children to others. They would never see each other again. Did Benjamin understand? Benjamin understood. Samuel and Daniel received similar explanations about what would happen to people they cared about if they failed to follow Edmund's instructions. The three men were trapped. They had no good options. They could refuse and watch their families destroyed, or they could comply and become complicit in whatever Edmund was planning to do to his daughter. It was not really a choice. It was just a different kind of torture, forcing them to inflict suffering on someone else to protect people they loved. That night, Benjamin told his wife Ruth what was going to happen. Ruth was horrified. She begged Benjamin to refuse, to run, to do something other than participate in torturing Edmund's daughter. Benjamin explained that running would accomplish nothing. They would be caught within days. Their children would be sold as punishment, and Margaret would still be subjected to whatever Edmund had planned, only with different men supervising her treatment. At least, if Benjamin was there, he could perhaps find small ways to make things less terrible, could ensure Margaret was not hurt worse than necessary. Ruth understood, but she hated it. She hated that this was the calculation enslaved people constantly had to make. Participate in cruelty to protect family, enable evil to prevent worse evil. There were no good choices, only different types of terrible choices. Samuel and Daniel had similar conversations with people they cared about. None of them wanted to do this. All of them felt they had no alternative. On the morning of June 14, 1846, Edmund brought Margaret to the barn. He had not told her beforehand what was planned. He had simply instructed her to dress in her oldest, plainest clothing and to come with him after breakfast. Margaret followed, confused but not yet alarmed. When they reached the barn and Edmund opened the door, Margaret saw Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel waiting inside. She saw the grain mill, the sparse sleeping area, the desk where Edmund would sit to document her treatment. Margaret turned to her father. "What is this?" "This is your treatment," Edmund said calmly. "You have proven yourself incapable of governing your own behavior. You have embarrassed me and yourself repeatedly. You have refused every reasonable attempt to help you become the kind of woman you should be. So I am taking direct action for the next several months. You will live in this barn. You will work every day under the supervision of these three men. You will learn discipline, humility, and obedience. When you have demonstrated sufficient improvement, the treatment will end and we will discuss your future." Margaret stared at him. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious. You will do exactly as these men instruct. You will complete whatever tasks they assign. You will sleep here, eat here, and work here until I determine that you have changed." Margaret's shock was giving way to anger. "This is insane. You cannot imprison your own daughter and force her to work like a slave." Edmund's expression did not change. "I am your father. I have both the legal right and the moral obligation to correct your behavior by whatever means necessary. The law supports me completely. You are an unmarried woman living in my household dependent on my support. You will do as I say or you will suffer the consequences." He gestured to Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel. "These men are now your supervisors. You will address them respectfully and follow their instructions. If you refuse, if you resist, if you attempt to leave this barn without my permission, I will make things considerably worse for you. Do you understand?" Margaret looked at the three men. They would not meet her eyes. They stood there, silent and miserable, waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret looked back at her father. "I understand that you have gone mad." Edmund nodded as if she had said something reasonable. "You may believe that now. In time you will see that I am doing this for your own good." He turned to Benjamin. "Begin the treatment." Then he left the barn, locking the door from the outside. For a long moment no one moved. Margaret stood near the door, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel remained where they were, none of them wanting to be the first to speak or act. Finally, Benjamin cleared his throat. "Miss Margaret," he said quietly, "your father has instructed us to put you to work. We do not want to do this. But if we do not follow his orders, Bad things will happen to people we care about. I am asking you to please cooperate so this can be as easy as possible for everyone." Margaret turned to look at him. Her initial anger was fading, replaced by dawning horror as she realized this was actually happening, that her father genuinely intended to keep her locked in this barn and force her to work like an enslaved person. She felt dizzy. She felt like the world had tilted sideways and nothing made sense anymore. "What am I supposed to do?" Margaret asked. Daniel gestured to the grain mill. "We need to grind corn. You will work the mill for 4 hours. Then you will have a short rest period. Then you will help Samuel haul water from the well to fill the troughs in the stables. Then you will work the mill again for another 4 hours. Then you will be given food and allowed to sleep." Margaret stared at the grain mill. 4 hours. "I have never worked a grain mill in my life. You will learn." Benjamin said, "It is not complicated. You just push the arm and keep pushing until the time is completed." Margaret wanted to refuse, wanted to scream and fight and demand to be released. But she was trapped. The door was locked. Her father had made it clear he would not relent. And these 3 men were following orders that threatened their families if they failed. There was no one to appeal to, no authority to call on, no escape. So Margaret walked to the grain mill and began to push. The wooden arm was heavier than she expected. It required real force to keep it moving in its circular path. Within minutes, Margaret's arms were aching. Within half an hour, she was exhausted. But she kept pushing because stopping would mean confronting what was actually happening, and she was not ready to face that yet. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel watched in silence. They were supposed to supervise to make sure she kept working to document her behavior in the ledger Edmund had provided. But none of them felt good about any of this. They were watching a white woman, the daughter of their owner, being subjected to treatment that mimicked their own daily experience of forced labor and powerlessness. It was disturbing in ways they struggled to articulate. Edmund returned at noon. He brought food for Margaret, a simple meal of cornbread and beans, the same rations enslaved workers received. He watched Margaret for several minutes, noting her exhaustion, her red face, her trembling arms. He opened the ledger and wrote his first entry. June 14th, noon. Subject shows initial resistance and shock. Physical exhaustion evident after 4 hours labor. Compliance achieved through lack of alternatives. Continue current routine. He left the food and departed without speaking to Margaret directly. That first day set the pattern for what would follow. Margaret worked the grain mill, hauled water, completed whatever tasks Benjamin assigned. She was given simple food twice per day. She slept on the thin mattress in the corner. Edmund visited regularly to document her progress, weighing her weekly, recording behavioral observations, adjusting the treatment routine based on what he saw. The days blurred together. Wake before dawn, work until exhaustion, eat minimal food, work more, sleep, repeat. Margaret's body began changing quickly. The constant labor and reduced food intake caused rapid weight loss. Within 3 weeks, she had lost over 20 pounds. Her hands developed calluses. Her muscles ached constantly. She was too exhausted to think clearly, too focused on surviving each day to plan any kind of resistance or escape. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel struggled with their role in this nightmare. They had been forced into positions where they had to actively participate in breaking someone, in destroying a woman's spirit through systematic cruelty. They tried to find small ways to make things easier for Margaret. Benjamin sometimes allowed her longer rest breaks when Edmund was not present. Samuel brought her extra water on particularly hot days. Daniel occasionally spoke to her gently, offering small encouragements that she was doing well, that she was stronger than she thought. But these small kindnesses could not change the fundamental reality. Margaret was being broken day by day, hour by hour. The treatment was working exactly as Edmund intended. By late July, Margaret had stopped expressing anger or defiance. She simply worked when told to work, ate when given food, slept when allowed. She spoke rarely. She cried sometimes at night when she thought no one could hear her. But during the day, she was becoming the obedient, broken thing Edmund wanted her to be. Edmund was pleased with the progress. His ledger entries documented Margaret's transformation. July 28th, subject weight down to 202 lbs, compliance now automatic, no verbal resistance in past week, physical condition improved despite weight loss, subject appears stronger, more capable of sustained labor, emotional affect flattened, continue current routine with slight increase in work requirements to maintain progress. If this story is disturbing you, if you are starting to understand just how calculated and systematic this torture was, I need you to do something. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this. Hit that like button to support content that uncovers these dark historical truths. And tell me in the comments, what do you think should happen to someone like Edmund Halloway? What kind of justice could possibly balance this kind of cruelty? Let me know your thoughts. Now let us continue with what happened in August when the barn became something even darker than a prison. By August of 1846, Margaret had been in the barn for 7 weeks. She had lost 43 lbs according to Edmund's meticulous records. Her body had changed dramatically, becoming leaner and harder from constant physical labor. But the more significant changes were psychological. The Margaret who had entered the barn in June, defiant and opinionated, was disappearing. In her place was someone quieter, more withdrawn. Someone who had learned that resistance accomplished nothing and that survival required absolute compliance. Edmund was satisfied with these changes, but he wanted more. He wanted Margaret completely broken, wanted every trace of her former self erased. So he began introducing new elements to the treatment. Unpredictability was key. Some days Margaret would be worked to exhaustion. Other days she would be given less work but no explanation for why. Some meals would be adequate, others would be half portions. Edmund wanted Margaret to never know what to expect, wanted her constantly off balance and unable to develop any sense of control. He also introduced punishments for invented infractions. Margaret would be accused of working too slowly, even when she was not. She would be told she had shown disrespect when she had said nothing at all. These accusations would result in additional work hours, reduced food, or other penalties. The goal was to make Margaret understand that her actions did not matter, that punishment or reward came at Edmund's whim, that she had no agency whatsoever. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel were forced to implement these changes. They hated it. The work had been terrible enough when it at least made some kind of sense, when Margaret could understand that completing tasks well would result in rest, that cooperation would lead to better treatment. But this new phase was pure psychological torture. They were required to gaslight Margaret, to accuse her of things she had not done, to punish her for imaginary failures. It was during this phase that something shifted between Margaret and her 3 supervisors. They began to see each other differently. Margaret had initially viewed Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel as extensions of her father's will, as enforcers of the torture she was experiencing. But as she watched them implement Edmund's increasingly cruel instructions, as she saw the discomfort and shame in their faces when they had to invent reasons to punish her, she began to understand that they were trapped too. They were forced to hurt her, to protect people they loved. They were victims of the same system that was destroying her, just in different ways. And Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel began seeing Margaret not as the master's daughter who existed in a completely separate world, but as a fellow human being suffering under cruelty that none of them deserved. Her pain was different from theirs in some ways. She was experiencing temporary imprisonment while they lived in permanent bondage, but pain was still pain. Suffering was still suffering, and watching someone be systematically broken, regardless of who that person was, created a kind of shared experience that crossed the line society had drawn. The first real conversation happened in mid-August. Edmund had left for the day after weighing Margaret and recording her progress. Margaret was sitting on the floor in the corner where she slept, exhausted after 8 hours at the grain mill. Benjamin was supposed to be watching her, making sure she did not try to escape or do anything Edmund would consider inappropriate. Samuel and Daniel had been sent to complete other tasks. Benjamin sat down on a stool about 10 feet from Margaret. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Benjamin said quietly, "I am sorry." Margaret looked up at him, surprised. He had never apologized before. None of them had. Sorry for what? For all of this. For what we have to do to you every day. For not finding a way to stop it. Margaret studied his face. Why are you doing it then? Why are you helping him? Benjamin explained about his family, about Edmund's threats, about the impossible choice he had been given. Margaret listened. When he finished, she said, "I understand. I am not angry at you. You are as trapped as I am." That simple statement of understanding changed something. It acknowledged the reality they were all living. That Edmund's cruelty trapped multiple people. That the system of slavery created situations where good people were forced to commit cruelties to survive. Over the following days, more conversations happened. Daniel told Margaret about being taught to read by his previous owner, about how literacy had opened his mind to ideas about justice and freedom. about how knowing those ideas existed but being unable to act on them was its own kind of torture. Samuel, who spoke least of everyone, eventually told Margaret about watching his mother sold away when he was 8 years old, about never seeing her again, about not even knowing if she was still alive. Margaret shared her own story. She told them about her mother's death, about the suffocating expectations placed on women, about being told her entire life that her only purpose was to marry well and produce children, about being treated as property, to be managed just like enslaved people were treated as property. She talked about reading books that suggested different possibilities, that argued women and enslaved people were human beings who deserved freedom and dignity, about being punished for believing those ideas. These conversations were dangerous. If Edmund discovered them, there would be severe consequences for everyone involved. But they happened anyway. Whispered exchanges during brief moments when Edmund was not present. Shared recognition that they were all trapped in a system that denied their humanity in different but related ways. It was Daniel who first raised the question of what came after. One evening in late August, after Margaret had been in the barn for 10 weeks, he asked her what would happen when the treatment ended. Edmund had said the treatment would continue until Margaret showed sufficient improvement. But what did that actually mean? What was Edmund's end goal? Margaret had been thinking about this question. She explained her understanding. Edmund wanted her broken enough to accept whatever he decided for her future. He would eventually arrange a marriage, probably to some man willing to take a wife with a damaged reputation in exchange for her inheritance. Margaret would be expected to be obedient, to never question or resist, to fulfill whatever role the husband required. She would live the rest of her life as a shell of herself going through motions but never truly alive. "And you would accept that?" Daniel asked. "What choice do I have?" Margaret replied. "He has proven he is willing to do anything to control me. Even if I survived whatever he did next, I would still be a woman in Mississippi in 1846. I have no legal rights, no independent means of support, no way to escape the system that treats me as property." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would change everything. "What if you did not have to accept it? What if there was another option?" Margaret looked at him. "What other option?" Daniel glanced around to make sure Edmund was not approaching. "I cannot speak of it here, but there are ways. People escape. People find freedom. It is dangerous. Most who try are caught and punished terribly. But some make it. If you were willing to risk everything, if you truly wanted to be free rather than just differently imprisoned, there might be a way." Margaret felt something she had not felt in months. Hope. It was terrifying and painful because hope meant caring about the future, meant believing something better might be possible. She had been so focused on surviving each day that she had stopped thinking about anything beyond the barn. But now Daniel was suggesting that survival was not the only option, that escape might be possible. "Tell me," Margaret said. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. First, I need to discuss this with Benjamin and Samuel. What we would be talking about would put everyone at terrible risk. All three of us would need to agree before anything could be planned, and you would need to understand exactly what you would be risking and what would be required." Margaret nodded. She understood. But something had changed. She was not just enduring anymore. She was starting to plan. Over the next week, Daniel spoke privately with Benjamin and Samuel. He explained what he was thinking. If they were going to be complicit in destroying Margaret's life, if they were going to spend months breaking her spirit so Edmund could marry her off to some man who would continue the abuse, then they were not just victims of the system. They were active participants in perpetuating it. But if they helped Margaret escape, if they used their position as her supervisors to create an opportunity for her freedom, then maybe they could salvage some small piece of their own humanity. Benjamin was hesitant. The risks were enormous. If they were caught helping Margaret escape, they would be killed. Their families would be sold away to the harshest plantations Edmund could find. Everyone who had ever helped them or shown them kindness would be punished as a warning to others. Was Margaret's freedom worth that risk? Daniel argued that it was not just about Margaret. It was about proving to themselves that they were not just tools of oppression, that they could choose to do something good, even when that choice was dangerous. Samuel surprised both of them by agreeing with Daniel immediately. Samuel said he had watched his mother sold away because she had tried to learn to read. He had watched his father beaten nearly to death for defending her. He had spent his entire life being careful, being obedient, trying not to give overseers any excuse to hurt him or people he cared about. And where had that gotten him? He was 37 years old, and he had never made a single meaningful choice in his entire life. Maybe it was time to make one. Benjamin thought about his wife Ruth and their 3 children. He thought about what Edmund would do to them if this plan failed. But he also thought about what kind of man he wanted his children to see when they looked at him. Did he want them to see someone who always chose safety over justice, who always protected himself at the expense of others? Or did he want them to see someone who, at least once in his life, had taken a terrible risk to do something right? On September 2nd, Benjamin told Daniel and Samuel that he was in. They would help Margaret escape, but they needed a plan that had some chance of actually succeeding. They needed to be smart and careful and willing to sacrifice everything if necessary. The 3 men began plotting. They could not meet openly or discuss this or anyone might overhear. So they communicated in fragments, brief exchanges while working, coded references that meant nothing to anyone who did not understand the context. Slowly a plan took shape. But developing that plan required understanding something they had not yet confronted. Why was Edmund really doing this? The treatment had officially been described as a cure for Margaret's defiance and obesity, but both of those problems were essentially solved. Margaret had lost over 50 pounds. She was compliant and obedient. Yet Edmund showed no signs of ending the treatment. He seemed to want it to continue indefinitely. Why? Daniel decided to investigate. He had been inside the main house many times to do carpentry work. He knew the layout. He knew where Edmund kept his private papers. If there was some deeper explanation for what Edmund was doing, some secret agenda beyond just breaking his daughter, evidence might exist in Edmund's study. On September 8th, Daniel was assigned to repair a window frame in the main house. He completed the work quickly, then waited until he heard Edmund leave the house to speak with an overseer about plantation business. Daniel slipped into Edmund's study. He worked fast, knowing he had only minutes before someone might notice his absence. He checked the desk drawers. Most were locked, but one opened. Inside were letters, business documents, and a small leather journal. Daniel grabbed the journal and flipped through it quickly, looking for anything related to Margaret. What he found made his blood run cold. The journal was not a diary. It was a business ledger documenting a breeding program Edmund had been operating for over a decade. The entries were clinical and detailed. Dates, names of enslaved women, names of the men Edmund had forced them to breed with, notes on the children produced, and their value. Edmund had been systematically forcing enslaved women to have children with men he selected based on physical characteristics he wanted to cultivate: strength, size, health, and other traits Edmund considered valuable. The children born from these forced pairings were being raised to be particularly valuable laborers, or to be sold at premium prices to other plantations looking for strong workers. But the most disturbing section was near the end. Edmund had written about the declining productivity of his breeding program. Several of the women who had been his most reliable breeders were now too old to have more children. He needed new women to replace them, young and healthy women who could produce strong children for the next 15 years. But purchasing new women was expensive and uncertain. You could not know for sure what you were getting until the woman had already produced several children, and by then you had invested years and substantial money. Edmund had written about considering a different approach. What if he bred his own daughter? Margaret came from good stock. His family had been in America for generations, strong and healthy people who lived long lives. Sarah's family was equally robust. Margaret herself, despite her obesity, was physically healthy. If she were paired with strong enslaved men, the children she produced would likely be valuable, and because Margaret was his daughter, Edmund would have complete control over her and her offspring. The problem was that Margaret would never cooperate willingly. She would refuse. She would resist. She would probably try to kill him if he attempted to force her. So Edmund needed to break her first, needed to destroy her will completely. The barn treatment was not about making Margaret marriageable. It was about making her compliant enough to accept being used as breeding stock. Edmund had never intended to end the treatment at all. He intended to keep Margaret imprisoned indefinitely, using her to produce children who would be legally enslaved because their fathers were enslaved, children Edmund could sell or use as he wished. Daniel felt physically sick reading this. Edmund was not just cruel, he was monstrous. He had built an entire business around forcing people to breed like animals, and now he was planning to do the same thing to his own daughter. Daniel carefully returned the journal to exactly where he had found it, then left the study and went back to his assigned work. That evening he told Benjamin and Samuel what he had discovered. They were horrified but not entirely surprised. They had known men who operated breeding programs. It was common enough among larger plantations, but targeting your own daughter was something else entirely. Margaret needed to know. That night, after Edmund had left the barn, Daniel told her what he had found. He explained about the journal, about the breeding program, about Edmund's actual plan for her future. Margaret listened in silence, her face straining of color. When Daniel finished, Margaret said only 4 words. "We leave tomorrow night." The plan they had been developing over the previous week was not complete. There were gaps, uncertainties, things that could go wrong, but none of that mattered anymore. Margaret could not stay in that barn another week knowing what Edmund intended. They would attempt escape immediately and either succeed or die trying. That night, Benjamin went home and told Ruth what was going to happen. He explained that he would be helping Margaret escape the next evening, that the plan was dangerous and might fail, that if it did fail, Ruth should take the children and run if she got any warning at all. Ruth held him and cried, but did not try to talk him out of it. She understood why this mattered. She understood that some things were worth dying for. Samuel and Daniel made their own preparations. They gathered supplies, small amounts of food that would not be missed, a knife, a length of rope. They identified the route they would take once they got Margaret out of the barn, north to the Mississippi River, then upriver toward free territory. It would take weeks. They would be pursued. The odds of success were poor, but it was possible, and possibility was enough. September 9th began like every other day. Margaret worked the grain mill. Edmund visited at mid-am morning to weigh her and document her progress. She had now lost 61 thalmoms. Edmund was pleased. He wrote in his treatment ledger that Margaret's physical transformation was nearly complete. Soon he would begin the next phase of her treatment, introducing her to her new purpose. He did not elaborate in the ledger about what that purpose was. He did not need to. He would never show this ledger to anyone. Edmund left at noon. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel went through their usual routine of supervising Margaret's work. Nothing about their behavior suggested anything unusual was planned. They had to be careful. The barn had windows. People walked past occasionally. Any suspicious activity would be reported to Edmund or the overseers. As evening approached, they finalized details. The escape would begin after dark, when most enslaved workers were in their cabins for the night. Benjamin would create a distraction on the far side of the plantation, a small fire that would draw the attention of overseers and anyone else who might notice Margaret leaving. While people were focused on the fire, Samuel and Daniel would unlock the barn and lead Margaret away toward the river. Benjamin would join them as soon as he could safely slip away from the fire without being noticed. At 9 o'clock, Benjamin started the fire. He had chosen a storage shed on the eastern edge of the plantation property, far from both the main house and the slave quarters. The shed contained old equipment and some stored tobacco, enough to burn hot and bright, but not so valuable that Edmund would be devastated by its loss. Benjamin lit the fire, then ran toward the main house, shouting that there was a fire, that people needed to help put it out before it spread. The response was immediate. Overseers grabbed buckets and organized workers to fight the fire. Edmund came running from the main house. Everyone's attention focused on the burning shed. In the chaos and confusion, no one noticed Samuel and Daniel unlocking the barn and leading Margaret out into the darkness. No one saw them disappear into the treine beyond the barn. No one realized anything was wrong until much later. Margaret, Samuel, and Daniel moved quickly through the woods, heading north. They had perhaps 2 hours before anyone discovered Margaret was missing, maybe less if Edmund decided to make an evening visit to the barn. Every minute counted. They needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Riverbend Plantation before the pursuit began. Benjamin joined them after 30 minutes, slipping away from the fire once it was clear the situation was under control and he would not be immediately missed. The 4 of them moved through the darkness, using the stars to navigate, avoiding roads and open areas where they might be seen. They knew pursuit would begin at dawn. Edmund would send out search parties with dogs. The searchers would check the river first, assuming the fugitives would try to cross or follow it north. So the plan was to move parallel to the river, but stay in the dense forest, making themselves harder to track. They traveled all night, stopping only briefly to rest. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 8 miles, not as much as they had hoped, but still significant distance. As the sun rose, they found a thick grove of trees and underbrush where they could hide during the day. Traveling in daylight was too dangerous. They would rest during the day and move again after dark. While they hid, they heard sounds of pursuit, dogs barking in the distance, men calling to each other as they searched the woods. The pursuit was methodical and thorough. Edmund had mobilized significant resources to find them, but the searchers were focused on areas closer to the plantation, assuming the fugitives could not have gone far in one night. The grove where Margaret, Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel were hiding was far enough away that searchers did not reach it on the first day. That night they continued north. The pattern repeated. Travel at night, hide during the day, listen to pursuit getting closer or farther away, depending on which direction the searchers focused. By the third day, they had covered over 20 men. They were exhausted, hungry, and terrified, but they were still free. Maybe, just maybe, they would actually make it. But on the fourth night, September 13th, their luck ran out. They had been traveling along a ridge above the river when they heard dogs behind them, closer than the dogs had ever been before. The searchers had changed their pattern, had begun searching farther from the plantation than they had initially, and somehow the dogs had picked up their scent. Benjamin, Samuel, Daniel, and Margaret ran. They crashed through underbrush, no longer worried about leaving tracks, just trying to stay ahead of the dogs and the men following them. The sounds of pursuit got closer, shouting voices. The dogs were gaining. They were going to be caught. Ahead, Margaret saw a barn. It was isolated, part of a small farm far from the main road. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney, meaning people were home. It was incredibly risky to approach, but the dogs were seconds away. They had no other choice. The four of them ran for the barn. Daniel reached the door first and threw it open. They all tumbled inside. Daniel slammed the door shut and dropped the bar to lock it. For a moment, they just stood there breathing hard, hearts pounding, listening to the dogs arrive outside. Men's voices called out. "They're in the barn surrounded. Don't let them escape. We've got them." Through gaps in the barn walls, Margaret could see torches. At least a dozen men, maybe more. Edmund's voice cut through the others. "Margaret, you have one chance. Come out now, and I will show mercy. Stay inside, and I will burn the barn with all of you in it." Samuel moved to the back wall of the barn, looking for another exit. There was none. They were trapped. Benjamin looked at Margaret. "I am sorry. We tried." Margaret shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. You gave me more than anyone else ever has. You gave me a chance." Edmund called out again. "You have 1 minute to decide. After that, my men will light this barn and you will burn." Margaret walked to the door. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked. "I'm going to talk to him. Maybe I can negotiate something." "You cannot trust him," Samuel said. "I know, but what other option do we have?" Margaret lifted the bar and opened the door slightly. Edmund stood 20 feet away holding a torch. Behind him his men held more torches, ready to set the barn ablaze. "Father," Margaret said, "let these men go. They were only following your orders. They did not want to help me escape. I forced them. I threatened them. They are innocent." Edmund laughed. "Innocent. They helped you run away. They destroyed property. They will face appropriate punishment, as will you. Now come out of that barn, all of you." Margaret felt Daniel, Samuel, and Benjamin behind her. She could hear their breathing. She thought about the past 4 months, about everything they had endured together, about the conversations that had made her understand she was not alone, that suffering created connections across the line society drew to separate people. She thought about what would happen if she obeyed. Edmund would take her back to the barn. The treatment would continue, but now it would be worse. He would implement his breeding plan. She would spend the rest of her life trapped in that nightmare, and Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel would be killed or sold away to plantations where they would work until they died. That was what obedience meant. That was the result of staying in the cage. Margaret made a decision. She stepped out of the barn and walked toward her father. Edmund smiled, thinking she was surrendering. Instead, Margaret grabbed the torch from his hand and ran back toward the barn. Edmund shouted. Men lunged to stop her, but Margaret was already inside, already dropping the torch onto the dry hay scattered across the barn floor. The fire caught immediately. Flames raced across the hay, up the walls toward the roof. Margaret dropped the bar back into place, locking the door from inside. Edmund and his men pounded on the door trying to break it down, but the door was solid and the bar was strong. By the time they broke through, it would be too late. Margaret turned to face Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel. Smoke was already filling the barn. They had minutes at most. "Why did you do that?" Benjamin asked, his voice stunned. "Because this way we choose. We are not hunted down and tortured. We are not separated and sold. We die together on our terms, denying him what he wanted. It is not victory, but it is not surrender either." Samuel coughed, smoke irritating his lungs. He nodded slowly. "I understand." Daniel looked at Margaret, then at the other two men. He reached out and took Margaret's hand. Then he took Samuel's hand. Benjamin completed the circle, taking Daniel's free hand and Margaret's free hand. They stood there in the center of the burning barn, connected, while flames rose around them and smoke filled the air, and Edmund screamed orders outside. "This is not the end I wanted," Margaret said quietly. "But it is the end I choose, and I am grateful I do not face it alone." The four of them stood together as the barn burned. They died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Dying together rather than separately, connected rather than isolated, choosing their end rather than accepting what others would have done to them. Edmund and his men eventually broke through the door, but it was too late. They pulled 4 bodies from the smoking ruins. Edmund stared at his daughter's burned corpse, feeling something he did not entirely understand. Was it grief, rage, shame? He could not identify it. He had been so certain he was right, so certain he was helping Margaret, correcting her, saving her from herself, and she had chosen death over accepting his help. What did that mean? Edmund never really answered that question. He told neighbors that Margaret had died tragically in a barn fire during an escape attempt with some enslaved people who had kidnapped her from his property. He commissioned a marble headstone for her grave. He never mentioned the barn treatment to anyone. The ledger documenting those 5 months was sealed and placed in the courthouse basement, where it would remain hidden for over a century. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel were buried in unmarked graves on plantation property. Their families were told they had been killed trying to escape. Ruth and her children were sold to a plantation in Louisiana within a week. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who defy the system. But the story did not end there. Ruth told her children what Benjamin had done, how he had risked everything to help someone who needed help, how he had chosen humanity over survival. Those children told their children. The story was passed down through generations, changing with each telling but keeping its core truth. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel had made a choice that mattered. In 2003, archaeologists conducting a survey of historical plantation sites in Adams County excavated the foundation of a barn on property that had once been part of Riverbend Plantation. In the burned remains, they found metal objects that had survived the fire: belt buckles, a knife blade, scraps of chain. They also found something more significant. Fused to a piece of burned timber was a gold locket. The locket had been exposed to intense heat but had not completely melted. When researchers carefully opened it, they found 2 miniature portraits inside, both badly damaged, but still partially visible. One appeared to be a man, the other a woman. The locket's back had an inscription, though most of it was illegible due to fire damage. Only 3 letters could be made out clearly. M.A.H. Margaret Ashworth Halloway. The locket was Margaret's, something she must have been wearing when she died. But why was it fused to timber in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately? Had someone, perhaps one of the men who died with her, removed it and placed it carefully somewhere, hoping it might survive as evidence of what happened? Researchers began investigating Margaret Halloway's story. They searched historical records looking for information about her death, about Edmund, about Riverbend Plantation. They found almost nothing. No newspaper accounts of the fire, no official investigation records, just a brief entry in Edmund's will written years later mentioning that his daughter Margaret had died in 1846. But they did find the sealed ledger in the courthouse basement, and when they read those 73 pages documenting Margaret's 5 months in the barn, they realized they had stumbled onto something far darker than a simple fire. The discovery made news briefly in 2003 and 2004. Historians debated what the ledger revealed about plantation life, about the treatment of women, about the ways cruelty operated systematically rather than just individually. But the story never gained widespread attention. It was too disturbing, too uncomfortable, too challenging to narratives people preferred to tell about history. Then in 2007, a man named William Fletcher contacted the Adams County Historical Society. Fletcher was a descendant of Samuel, one of the 3 men who died in the barn with Margaret. He had family documents, letters, and testimonies passed down through generations that provided additional details about what happened in 1846. Fletcher had been hesitant to make these documents public, concerned about privacy and about how his ancestors' story might be received. But after learning about the ledger discovery and the archaeological evidence, he decided the full story needed to be told. Fletcher's documents included a letter written by Ruth, Benjamin's widow, to a minister in 1855. In the letter, Ruth described what Benjamin had told her the night before the escape attempt. She explained about Margaret's treatment, about Edmund's breeding program, about the decision Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel had made to help Margaret escape, even knowing it would likely cost them their lives. Ruth's letter also included details about Margaret's death that had been passed through the network of enslaved people at Riverbend and neighboring plantations. People who had been present the night of the fire, who had watched it happen, who knew the truth, even if they could never speak it publicly. According to these accounts, Margaret had not accidentally started the fire. She had deliberately set it, choosing to die on her own terms rather than be recaptured and subjected to worse horrors. And the three men had agreed with her choice, had stood with her in those final moments, creating a death that was tragic, but also defiant, that denied Edmund the victory he had sought. This version of events aligned with the physical evidence. The barn door had been barred from inside. The fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, not spreading gradually from a single point as an accidental fire would. Someone had intentionally set the barn ablaze and locked everyone inside. The Historical Society compiled all the evidence into a report published in 2008. The report was thorough and well documented, but it reached a limited audience. Most people never heard about Margaret Halloway or the barn at Riverbend Plantation. The story remained obscure, known mainly to historians who specialized in this particular dark corner of American history. In 2016, a historical marker was placed near the site where the barn had stood. The marker's text was carefully worded, describing what happened in clinical language that avoided the most disturbing details. It said that Margaret Halloway and 3 enslaved men died in a barn fire in 1846 during an attempted escape from Riverbend Plantation. It noted that sealed records discovered in 1958 revealed Margaret had been subjected to forced labor treatment by her father. It mentioned the gold locket in the archaeological evidence, but it did not go into detail about Edmund's breeding program or about the calculated psychological torture documented in the ledger. Some truths, it seemed, were still too disturbing to present fully to the general public. Edmund Halloway continued operating Riverbend Plantation until his death in 1862. He never remarried after Sarah died. He never had other children after Margaret. His will left the plantation to a nephew who sold it shortly after Edmund's death. The property changed hands multiple times over the following decades. By the early 20th century, the main house had been demolished and the land divided into smaller farms. Nothing visible remained of Riverbend Plantation, except some old foundation stones and the family cemetery where Edmund and Sarah were buried. Margaret's grave was there too, with its marble headstone bearing her name and dates and the inscription, "Beloved Daughter." Some descendants of enslaved people from Riverbend still live in Adams County. They know the stories passed down through their families. They know what Edmund did, what Benjamin and Samuel and Daniel did, what Margaret chose in those final moments in the burning barn. For them, the story is not obscure history. It is family history, part of their understanding of who they are and where they came from. The barn's location is on private property now. The current owners know about the historical marker, but do not particularly want people visiting the site. There is nothing to see anyway. Just a field where soybeans grow. Unremarkable land that gives no indication of what happened there in 1846. But the story persists not in mainstream histories or popular accounts, but in academic papers and family narratives and conversations among people who study the darkest aspects of how American society was built. This mystery shows us that cruelty operates systematically, not just individually. Edmund did not suddenly decide to torture his daughter. He implemented a carefully planned program of psychological destruction based on methods he learned from men who specialized in breaking enslaved people. The barn treatment was not an aberration. It was the logical extension of a system built on the premise that some people could be treated as property, that power justified any action, that compliance could be forced through calculated cruelty. It also shows us that resistance takes many forms. Margaret could have obeyed, could have accepted the treatment, could have emerged broken and compliant as Edmund intended. Instead, she chose connection with the men who were trapped alongside her. She chose to see them as human beings rather than as tools of her father's oppression. And ultimately, she chose to die free rather than live enslaved. Even though freedom in that moment meant death, Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel made similar choices. They could have simply followed orders, could have told themselves they were just doing what they had to do to survive. Instead, they chose to help someone who needed help. Even when helping meant risking everything they had, they chose humanity over survival. And in those final moments in the burning barn, they chose solidarity, standing together rather than dying separately. These were not perfect choices. They were not heroic in any conventional sense. They did not save lives or change the system or create lasting justice. 4 people died in that barn, and the system that created the horror continued for another generation until the Civil War finally ended slavery in Mississippi. But within the context of impossible situations and limited options, Margaret, Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel made choices that affirmed their humanity and denied their oppressors total victory. That is worth remembering. What do you think of this story?